I think we're ready to start this evening. Thank you all for coming this evening to Rem's lecture. It's a great pleasure, I think, for all of us in the DRL especially to have Rem here for this year's candidacy week, where our students present the results of their thesis projects and research they've been doing over the last year here in the program. We're all very grateful that Rem could join us for both this evening's lecture and as a juror for our students' presentations, the first day of which we just finished about an hour ago, and able to clear the room and set up for tonight. We'll be continuing that conversation and the presentations tomorrow. We'll be doing 6 more projects beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning. This year, Rem is joined by Sanford Quinter from the States, Bart Lutzma from the Netherlands, Zaha Hadid from here in London, and Federico Soriano, an architect from Spain, who will be giving tomorrow evening's lecture here in the AA. Rem was here almost exactly a year ago at the AA and presented a kind of remarkable range of projects that are currently in the office, and projects that we had a chance to see about a month ago when we went over and visited the office in Rotterdam to see some of the recent buildings in Berlin, in the United States, the IIT scheme, and on the West Coast, the studio project in Los Angeles. Rem is going to use tonight's lecture to do something kind of slightly different than what he presented last year, which is an opportunity to go through some of the research that he didn't really begin or initiate so much as sort of consolidate in a studio at Harvard University a couple of years ago, which resulted in a kind of pre-publication document that I think is referred to as the Harvard Guide to Shopping, as a part of his Harvard project for the city. It's a kind of ongoing research project that has examined the evolution, scope, and the kind of various formed crises that the status of shopping are creating for the city today, and trying to think of a way to kind of confirm its topicality. I was reminded of one of our students in a design workshop we did in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, and a student who sort of through day 3 or 4 of the presentation thought that the word workshop meant spending sort of half the time working and the other half shopping in Hong Kong, and which is probably as good a confirmation of the relevance of what Rem calls the kind of blurring of normal terms that are used to describe the city as any other. Please join me in welcoming Rem Koolhaas.
Can you switch the light off, please? It is very appropriate, I think, today, where I was a witness to a studio that incorporated research in design work, to present the work I have been doing with thesis students in Harvard. Can we have the lights off, please? Since 3 years now. What is different and what is perhaps unique in the kind of Harvard situation is that we do not claim that... Can the light go off kind of entirely, please? Anyway, eventually it has to go out entirely. Anyway, what I think is unique at Harvard is that we radically severed any connection with design. In fact, I became a teacher at Harvard on condition that I never had to mention design, and never had to think about design, and never had to educate kind of in the design field. And that I could purely concentrate on research. The importance of concentrating on research is that for me there is increasingly one extremely painful aspect in almost any architecture, and in the kind of inherent and essential an essential problem about the kind of architectural imagination, perhaps, that is that the architect, no matter how sophisticated his intellectual or her intellectual apparatus is, how sensitive her or his design abilities, that we have a kind of mute relationship with what exists, simply because our profession is entirely programmed to change what exists. And I think that kind of dilemma, the dilemma that in spite of our sophistication, we are bound to change things, and unable fundamentally to leave things alone, and therefore unable to learn from situations that exist, is really a kind of almost a basis of stupidity for an otherwise highly evolved profession. And that is an issue that we have been kind of trying to address at the Harvard Project for the City. The Harvard Project for the City is no longer called Harvard Project for the City, because the name Harvard may not be used or abused by Harvard's teachers. And that is a kind of an ironic and interesting thing that we have to, we'll discuss later. That kind of ironically now that universities are considering themselves brand, even those involved in the university are not allowed to use the brand with impunity. So our project is now called Project on the City, and maybe we succeed in calling it the GSD project on the city. GSD is the Graduate Design School, which has been rebranded because the name Harvard doesn't appear in it. So it is now called Harvard Design School. I made a proposal during a number of meetings to drop the word school so that it would be called Harvard Design, but that has been kind of rejected too. So because then at least we could have been the Harvard Design School, Harvard Design Project on the city. Anyway, this is one of those strange little vignettes of modernization, but also strange little vignettes of the pervasiveness of market forces, in this case turning themselves against serious research. The intention of the Harvard Project on the City is very simple, to take every year one particular urban condition, either a site of intense urban development or a site of intense urban mutation, or a subject, and I should say that in a way we are trying to resume a way of thinking about the city which was very well evolved perhaps in the 60s and 70s, when it was kind of seen, where the process of urbanization was seen as a potentially exciting development, in a way anticipating, of course, globalization, and where in diagrams like this one by Dipsiadis, the world was divided in kind of areas of intense mutant urban conditions. Those are the black conditions, and kind of grayer areas in between. And if you consider that this diagram is almost 30 years old, then it is kind of surprising how accurate it is, and how it also corresponds with our current program. The first project we have been dealing with is the Pearl River Delta, which is kind of in the center of this black area. The second project we have done is the Harvard Guide on Shopping, which is looking at one single phenomenon and the way it affects the urban condition worldwide. And the third project, which we're currently doing, is the study of urbanization in West Africa. Now, I have to say a little bit about why we are doing this project and what we're doing, trying to do with it. Obviously, we're doing it so that we get wiser. Usually, we work with between 8 and 12 students. In general, the program consists of field work, so we go to the specific situation, which means that we've been going to the Pearl River Delta in the beginning. I'm about to go to Lagos, Nigeria, and for the shopping project we went to various locations over the world, but culminating in a congress for 3,000 developers in Las Vegas. So it is essentially field work. Then over the summer, most of the students work in the area that we are investigating, sometimes in commercial offices or bureaucracies, so that they don't have a kind of visitor's knowledge, but a really intimate knowledge. And then the next term or the next half year, we are working on trying to turn this research into books. This is the Harvard Guide to Shopping, the dummy, and if everything goes according to plan, we'll be publishing 2 books simultaneously in the fall, the one on China and the one on Harvard. Now, what we are frankly trying to do with the project is to try to resurrect a vocabulary to discuss the urban condition. Our thesis, or the underlying thesis of the project, is that no current way of talking about the city is adequate, certainly not the way that is integral to the architectural profession and has been developed or honed over the years, because it is very clear that our words and our concepts are not only inadequate to discuss what is happening in certain real and highly charged urban conditions, but that actually our vocabulary guarantees a fundamental separation and a fundamental incomprehension about those phenomena. In other words, we are the prisoners of a very traditional intellectual structure, and therefore we are incapable of looking at everything that is against or beyond that intellectual structure. So what we're trying to do is to invent every year 50 terms and to extract from our research 50 terms that we then kind of introduce and use as a gift. First we copyright them, but then we use them as a gift for the profession so that it can perhaps better understand and begin to discuss phenomena that kind of previously have not been able to discuss except in the most negative and kind of rejecting and moralistic terms. For instance, one of the key issues that we encountered in Pearl River Delta, which is the region around Hong Kong, which consists of 6 cities, which are now counting 12 million inhabitants, but which we will have in 2020 36 million inhabitants. It is, in other words, the fastest growing urban region in the world. It is a region that is producing each year 500 square kilometer of urban substance. That is kind of probably bigger than the entire surface of London every year. So basically a phenomenon like that is strictly beyond our comprehension, but also brutalities such as visible in this image, where nature is destroyed with relish to be replaced by an urban condition, need new words or new definitions of old words, perhaps, such as tabula rasa, which of course, as we know, has been the bane of the 20th century and the Achilles heel of modern architecture. It's kind of supposed dependency of tabula rasa. Here in Asia currently, and also elsewhere, of course, the tabula rasa is a program that is pursued with relish, conviction, and the whole status of newness in these kind of conditions has a completely different value, a value that again for the classical profession is almost incomprehensible. The whole notion of the city in these situations where growth is so incredibly fast, apparently unplanned, but I'm saying apparently, is visible in this particular image, which is the main intersection in the city of Shenzhen. And as you can see here, this is the main intersection. As you can see, the main intersection, the most metropolitan point, is less than 300 meters away from rice fields and beyond that kind of mountains. So what is becoming kind of very evident there is that the city, and also in this particular image, the city is no longer a kind of homogeneous condition. You can also say that the city is certainly not a composed entity. You can see that it grows so incredibly quickly that anything that is slightly difficult to digest is simply left alone, like a mountain. It's incorporated in the city, but it's not itself urbanized. And perhaps what we are witnessing here and in many other places in the world is the definitive disappearance of any notion of contrast between that which is urban and that which is not urban. The urban condition as a pervasive condition, swallowing everything, establishing itself everywhere, but also coexisting perhaps in a new way with elements of nature, or at least elements that are non-city. This is the center of Shenzhen. What is phenomenal is that no single part of this image is older than 8 years. So the entire skyline here was generated and built in 8 years. And what is of course unique is that the downtown is itself an unbuilt condition, and that is perhaps proof of the capacity of the unbuilt now, given the unwieldiness of everything which is built, and given the kind of inherent slowness of everything that is built, to perform according to current expectations. And perhaps the model or the paradigm for these cities, and it's a paradigm which is of course kind of utterly antithetical to anything that we have been learned to believe, is perhaps no more complex than the Photoshop program. Namely, on Photoshop you can effortlessly combine everything you like in a single image with utter promiscuity and no kind of resistance of any kind. And therefore it is perhaps, in spite of our tradition of judgment and tradition of weighing, a very interesting moment of tilting towards another conception of the city, where it is kind of simply a condition of immediate gratification and deliberate thoughtlessness that in such can perhaps also establish new conditions and new relationships, as for instance between the built and the unbuilt. Now, we haven't we are in the middle of our African research, but maybe I can kind of indicate a number of elements that interest us. On one hand, we want to see to what extent old and traditional African patterns can return in African cities, and if you see their amazing lack of density, you come to the conclusion that kind of paradoxically, where perhaps a new characteristic of Pearl River Delta, which is a situation undergoing acute development, and a city like Lagos, which is undergoing, or which has been neglected for over 30 years, and where modernization, instead of going forward on a kind of upward curve, has at least stabilized and to a certain extent is going downward. And that itself is of course a phenomenon of extreme interest. Also, especially given the fact that in spite of this downward curve, the city is growing enormously, and at this moment nobody knows really how big it is, but it might be that it is a city of 20 million people. And even there we see the same mysterious urban field emerging of kind of occasional intensities in themselves large degrees of sparseness. These are just some images that I'm not going to... But already here some new words are being coined. Perhaps one of the eloquent one is Mercopolis, which is perhaps a new topology that is also relevant in other conditions. Anyway, I now want to talk about the Harvard Guide to Shopping, or the Harvard Project to Shopping. We are currently negotiating whether we can use this title. Otherwise, we have to resort perhaps to the Norman Mailer strategy, which is the last two words and an asterisk, or we're not finished with kind of thinking about it. Anyway, what I should say is that we're not interested in the history of shopping, and in a true way we could even say that we're not interested in shopping, but we are interested in the effect shopping has on the urban condition. And because we took our research seriously, we began with kind of analyzing with a kind of quantitative operation, where we simply wanted to understand and wanted to know what the quantities of shopping are that are currently present in Europe. You all realize probably, and partly the reason of why you're here is that you're living in England, which is the country with the highest quantity of shopping in Europe. So we are very highly kind of serviced by shopping and surrounded by shopping, and then you see that As you get closer to the Mediterranean basin, shopping becomes, if not a rarity, at least proportionally a much less important component of the urban condition. Here we see shopping in Asia, and we see there that Japan is, of course, is the most extreme condition, almost English-like in its pervasiveness of shopping, but that also countries like Korea, Malaysia, and of course Singapore are highly highly equipped at shopping, to the point that at a certain percentage and at these quantities, the urban condition itself changes beyond recognition, and that is what the project tries to do, to kind of intercept urban conditions at the moment that they are undergoing change, and trying to speculate, of course, what direction the change can take, and try to learn from the change in terms of kind of general prediction. It is very and stringently not our intention to benefit from it in terms of design. Of course, we are permeated by the knowledge, but we don't do it to design shopping centers in Singapore or anything like that. So anyway, this was the world in terms of shopping, and here we try to quantify what that means. The entire shopping reservoir of the world is 33 times the entire surface of Manhattan, which is kind of really a truly astounding quantity. This is another stunning statistic, that according to the United Nations, Walmart sales are larger than the gross domestic products of 3/4 of the world economies. In other words, it's nothing new, perhaps, that corporations are transnational and kind of in certain ways more important, but still, if a single one is so important, it really implies. And what is perhaps, because that as architects is for us the most interesting thing, there are 25 million square meters of Walmart. It was the quantities itself which are so absolutely stunning and again, represent a mutation. Here we investigated how much each civilization has to offer in terms of shopping space and shopping square meters for its citizens. And of course, the United States tops the list, and then we are kind of in descending order of civilization. But of course, it is also very important to realize that this enormous reservoir of shopping have to be supported by ourselves, and that they represent a kind of invisible tax. And that we don't receive shopping as a gift, but shopping is, in that sense, a very demanding gift. What this, for me, can represent is it is the unexpected denouement of the 20th century, that shopping has become the terminal activity of the human race, the final phase of modernization. Its pervasiveness surreptitiously erodes what we used to call civilization, shifts parameters, and smoothly and silently establishes an inescapable paradigm, a universe of both systematic oversaturation and undernourishment. And I think that this combination, this kind of wrenching combination of incredible stimulation and at the same time a kind of poverty, explains a lot of our ambiguity. This is an investigation in terms of which architects have had a professional relationship with shopping, and of course there are very few of them because shopping is not a subject that we take very seriously. And what is also interesting to know is that the oldest architect, who is the Daniel Burnham in Chicago, who made this kind of magnificent series of department store, is still considered an official architect, but that as we move to the mid-century, we are talking about Victor Gruen, who is already a kind of figure apart, and then we move to the current period, and with John Jurdy in America, And Jurdy is already beyond the pale, not really an architect. So what we can say here is that somehow at the end of the 19th century, shopping was a legitimate subject of architecture. But in the middle of the 20th century, the legitimacy was eroding, also were narrowed very precisely. And at the end of the 20th century, at the moment of its apotheosis, it is no longer taken seriously by the architecture profession. So these I'm trying to weave a number of streaks that I will return to later. So first we looked at quantities, then we looked at the relationship between those quantities and the architectural profession. Then we looked also at a cluster of inventions, roughly speaking between 1860 and 1920, which were the necessary cluster for shopping to emerge in its present configuration. And of course, some of them are obvious. There is the catalog, there's the radio, which is essential to make radio commercials. There are elements, kind of strict elements as the counter, the interior skin that encloses the volume of shopping. There's air conditioning, which creates kind of space conditioning, I would prefer to call it. Because it creates conditioned space, and I think it is slightly bizarre that we've never seen it as an architectural phenomenon that has vast repercussions on the production of space. But perhaps more important than any one of them, the escalator. Because what is the point of the escalator is that it denies difference between the different floors. And that kind of instead of the elevator, which connects floors, but in connecting them kind of insists on their separateness, the escalator has the opposite effect, namely of organizing flows over various levels, but without kind of insisting that there is a difference. It is continuous. The escalator establishes a continuous floor condition, and not for nothing is it divided in small steps and small mini floors. So by being a kind of collection of mini floors, it is the beginning of a continuous architecture that we will come back to later. So here in this image, the escalator is part of a kind of heroic workers condition, and simply the mass, let's say the original phase of modernization, where the masses themselves were imbued with dignity, but in reality the performance of the escalator is much more brutal and crude, because this is of course what the escalator is, and very quickly a kind of bridge to an invisible financial heaven. It doesn't end, and it doesn't need to end, because we all know what it is for. And very early in the century, the essential diagram was kind of perfectly established, and this is also the interesting thing about the idea of continuous floors. Continuous floor are continuous urban condition, and therefore continuous services that are potentially imbued with the ability to generate money. Here we have simply the curve of escalators in the world. And you see that kind of in itself, it is a phenomenal ascent that, of course, in a pretty drastic way, describes why the world is the way it is and kind of what is actually happening. And it is peculiar that an element which is such a radical introduction is so seamlessly and kind of, let's say, without questioning, involved, taken for granted. Now, what is for me, what was for me one of the kind of most surprising things, because the exciting thing about the Harvard project on the city is that it starts on the basis of ignorance of its leadership. Namely, I didn't know anything from shopping, nor anything about China, and so that we put ourselves all in a position of ignorance and therefore openness. So what we all assumed is that shopping is kind of uncontested activity in relatively vigorous health, but nothing is further from the truth, neither in America nor here. These are curves or graphs of new starts of shopping centers. So you see that actually shopping is in a degree of decline, and that in itself makes a very spectacular and so for unarticulated condition here. This is also trends in sales. It's not only the shopping sites which are in decline, but also the sales. And so shopping that we consider as an element of a healthy, an irrevocable element of a healthy city, and that we assume has its own commercial vigor, is in fact far from vigorous. And I think that the fact that shopping is at the same time triumphant and in some kind of death knell is perhaps the most intense tension, or the real tension, that the whole issue of shopping kind of generates, and that also explains its curious and unstable effects on the culture. It is not simply that shopping is growing and growing, and it is in agony and in triumph at the same time, and that not only is it kissue-mogged by the online shopping, although it is a very important underlying theme, but here these are a number of kind of public elements which are kind of interesting to read. That basically large sections of Asia, not only through the Asian crisis, this was before the Asian crisis, are in fact in extremely tenuous existence. Here some security analysts are warning that in 600 of the nations, this is America, 2,000 regional malls may be closed or converted, and converted is perhaps one of the more interesting notions here, conversion, in the coming years. And here aggressive billable market chief executive David Gold, the old retail consultant Stanley, are predicting 50 to 70% of present retail will be extinct within the decade. And so this is a kind of fantastic phenomenon, because basically everywhere we are surrounded by mushroom clouds of shopping, but perhaps all those clouds will be deflated within 10 years, and we'll be facing a phenomenal, and maybe that is the moment that shopping kind of will finally become accessible to the architectural imagination, because we our main task in architecture will be to convert shopping centers to enhance their spatial qualities and to make them fit for other forms of public life. Perhaps reconquer them. And the same is true for themed phenomena. We again assume that the Disneyfication is inevitable, but there are already the first signs that Disneyfication is in itself kind of in retreat, and that the kind of incredibly morbid quality of a kind of given mythology that is recycled, that is designed by a dead person, and that is kind of recycled in the 20th century and regurgitated with every year, is getting to us and is no longer as commercially kind of viable as it once was. There is a category in shopping which is the big box, or the category killer, and that is one of the kind of weakness of shopping. How, of course, a new topology is invented every 10 years, and that topology has a cannibalistic effect on all the previous topologies and weakens them. And perhaps this is the most shocking statistic of all. The average shopper spent in malls, time shopper spent in malls dropped by half from from 80 to 90. So, in other words, shopping is not at all vigorous. Shopping is dying, and all the kind of appearance of vigor is simply theater, or desperation, or marketing, very cleverly disguised. So, what does a dying phenomenon do? It develops, of course, a heightened intelligence, and it exploits and uses all the means at its disposal for its survival. And therefore, it is again very interesting to see that the moment of shopping's agony is now coinciding with a kind of unbelievable proliferation of technical abilities to keep track of the consumer. And therefore the beauty of the kind of shopping system as a kind of closed story or a kind of hermetic universe is that if the shopper doesn't come voluntarily to the store, then shopping will retaliate with military precision and, and get him where he resides. You know, get him, smoke him out of his habitat. Now, for this position, there are several beautiful systems. This is a kind of financial topography of America that exists also for Europe and also for Asia, which doesn't show kind of real mountains and valleys, but which simply shows the landscape of money, where money can be found. It is an atlas, and therefore it is very clear that if you want to have a kind of Armani boutique, you should go to probably kind of midway to one of the peaks, and a Kentucky Fried Chicken probably comes somewhere here. So this is kind of just so there is basically a new kind of landscaping, and the word landscape has been kind of used, of course, and abused hundreds of times today in every architectural school. But this is a landscape that gets rarely discussed, but which is perhaps also very critical. Then there are, of course, increasingly sophisticated computer programs and software tools that simulate quantum physics and computer modeling allow supermarkets to predict things with enormous accuracy, which is simply true. There is a spatial model, also spatial view, which again kind of zooms in with kind of increasing precision on the behavior of the shopping. And even where in the kind of 60s and 70s, of course, there was still a kind of paranoia about what the consequences of, for instance, electronic identities, electronic transactions, the way privacy was undermined by all of these, is now completely converted by a boast of American Express that it knows exactly in a given kind of suburban situation, which is not accidentally taken as if it is a kind of satellite photograph, knows exactly the behavior of every person, and that is a kind of virtue that can be sold and bought. Here we have another kind of system of where this kind of increasingly militaristic tracking is measured and recorded, a kind of infrared system that has a small reader on a shopping cart, and that kind of follows, again by satellite, the movement through a given supermarket of a given client, and then kind of either adjust the supermarket, the wares, the things that you can buy there, but in a kind of more sinister development that is even kind of using Star Wars technology, using and it's kind of really it's kind of correct to read this, because it's your Star Wars technology is being used by retailers to recapture possible store defectors in a in a preemptive strike before they start shopping elsewhere. Chevy has already used the artificial intelligence systems from IBM called IDA, Artificial Intelligence Discrimination Architecture, and it's this is architecture which was initially developed to detect and identify Russian missiles in space, but is now finding a place in large-scale data processing when it trialed a national pilot about 6 months ago. Current guy, etc. So the system analyzes information on buying patterns using details of purchases from loyalty cards. Once fully developed, it is hoped that the scheme, which works in conjunction with Mind, a campaign marketing program, will be able to spot consumer unhappiness by cross-checking existing sales patterns through data from loyalty cards with current baskets. If there is a noticeable drop in sale, IDA will recognize the disparity and will activate corrective measures, such as direct mail and special offers, which can be used to entice the errant shopper back to the fold. But of course it is supposedly humorous, but I think It's not humorous, and let's say, and what I think, and this is something, a quote that I wanted to read at the beginning, but I forgot, or maybe I lost it. Okay, well, we get to it eventually. Sorry, and yeah, so here, so already there are all these acronyms like MIND, and this is kind of similar to the analyses we made of technological inventions. This is a kind of cluster or a smudge, to use the terminology of this afternoon, or smear of marketing and psychology investigations that are also able, used by shopper to increasingly identify the needs of the shopper. And that is the ultimate consequence of this precision is, of course, that you're no longer addressing large groups, but that the precision itself kind of isolates the individual consumer, and that as a kind of ultimate consequence you have a kind of consumer of one, or a segment of one. In other words, a kind of ultimate loneliness at the mercy of all these precisions. So new confinement in managed diversity, and that is kind of in itself, there's no accident that the word supermarket was connected with imprisonment this afternoon. It is also true that the military metaphor is not only a metaphor, but for instance, a large percentage of the generals that worked in the Gulf War immediately after demobilization joined major shopping empires such as Sears, because their experience with logistics was crucial for their work. What you think now, what I think is happening here is perhaps the following shift, that where it used to be that we were kind of, with a relative confidence, be able to divide the city or the urban condition in private and public elements, in which the private sphere was clearly the sphere of the atmosphere, or the sphere of the family, and the public was some kind of public body that supported a public realm at its expense, of course with the tax of the private citizens, but still at its expense. That basically that model has completely collapsed, and that there is another model that could be substituted, which consists of highly controlled spaces, called in this area, and this is basically an aerial photograph that indicates the various degrees of control that can be exercised in each of these boxes, and those control spaces are surrounded by a kind of an area of complete residue. So more than public-private, the opposition seems to go to the controlled and the residual. And I think the notion of the residual is perhaps another, or nothingness is another thing we have to come to terms with. It is present in China, it is present in America, it's present in Africa. So that kind of relatively different cultures and political systems and economic degrees of modernization, nevertheless all show the same disintegration. Now, I've mentioned the way in which shopping is at the same time triumphant, but also in agony and in a serious crisis, and that is revealed in this diagram, where the gray shows the increase in scale of shopping, the increase in presence in shopping, but where you see here still kind of separate streaks of shopping, you see that in the end there tends to be a kind of merger between shopping and a number of other activities, not to say shopping and all other activities. So what you can see here very clearly is that shopping, in order to survive, has to hybridize itself with almost all other activities. You know, here in this school it's kind of very modest because it's a kind of small bookstore, but it is very clear that for instance, increasingly in airports, in shopping centers, in museums, in entertainment areas, the separation between shopping and all other, even in a hospital, something, in order to survive, has to hybridize itself with almost all other activities. And you know, here in this school it's kind of very modest because it's a kind of small bookstore, but it is very clear that in, for instance, increasingly in airports, in shopping centers, in museums, in entertainment areas, the separation between shopping and all other, even in hospitals, and all other activity is getting increasingly smaller. And given the fact that shopping is also something, as we defined it before, that is simultaneously oversaturated and undernourished, underwhelming. This sense of hollowness is therefore increasingly present in more and more of what used to be separate components of our culture, or separate entities of our culture. I think it also has a kind of drastic kind of formal consequence, which you see in this drawing. I think that there is still a latent assumption that large-scale elements are organized in rigorous ways, and that there is that infrastructure itself has a strong geometric logic in many cases. Not a single airport is not in some way kind of based on a linear model, but increasingly these kind of in themselves strictly logical elements are being inhabited in a completely chaotic way, and in a kind of way as if they really are a village. And what you get in increasing amounts is that the main architecture still suggests rigor, but that the inhabitation, the crust where human circulation occurs, is the opposite of rigor and is actually a labyrinthine, and where the airport, you know, suggests a clear path from A to B, that the practice of these spaces is now to obfuscate exactly, to make you lose the clear path, and to so this is, let's say, infrastructure as it was traditionally conceived, and here is infrastructure as it is now performing. So basically all exits and all signs even kind of reduced and kind of replaced or overwhelmed by signs that have absolutely nothing to do with the other messages. So here the blur that occurs is certainly not in anyone's interest, and it's certainly not efficient, but it's still efficient for on some other terms, perhaps. So here you see the airport turning into a village, or kind of something much more informal and almost medieval. And not only the airport, to the point that the British Airport Authority is now also organizing shopping centers, so it's basically dropping the mask of and the pretext of airport completely to focus on the area of its greatest competence. But here the same phenomenon is true in museums. Since '92, gallery space has increased 3% and museum store space by 29%. Here you see the Rauschenberg exhibition at Soho Guggenheim. Rumor has it that I was disqualified from the MoMA competition by this particular image, by calling it MoMA Inc. But nevertheless, 2 months after the competition, a director of marketing was appointed by Glenn Rowery, and here there's a kind of beautiful Glenn Rowery, the museum director, said he wanted to extend the retail reach well beyond the catalog and existing stores. We will look at freestanding stores, electronic stores, licensing, branding, wholesaling at the national and international level. He said, Mr. Gunner, for his part, is already referring to the MoMA brand. And this is, again, a fairly kind of interesting statistic. At MoMA, a square foot yields 1,700. At the Mall of America, 600. And at the average American mall, 250. And I think it's at moments like this one that, you know, all kind of moral judgments in a way are short-circuited, because it's totally unclear what you can think of this. or at least for me. Mies shop. So now another strand. This is the strand which is for me personally kind of in a way almost hypnotically interesting. The incredible short trajectory between authentic observation, integrity and debasement in about 20 years. I hope that most of you still, I cannot say remember, but know that kind of somewhere in the 60s, Jane Jacobs, a theoretician from Toronto, rediscovered the street and made a magnificent book writing about her discovery and how the street was the only authentic element or was the essential basis for the urban condition in providing kind of huge diversity and sustaining itself and being the only inherently creative medium in which the urban condition could permanently evolve. That notion of the street was within 10 years institutionalized by the bureaucrats of Manhattan in terms of forcing every building operation in Manhattan to respect the street, and if you respected the street you were even allowed to make skyscrapers taller because you respected the street, which is now 10 years later again turned into a city of shopping where street life instead of being promoted or enriched is actually on a kind of permanent process of impoverishment and erosion. And I think that this sentence is another significant sentence in the book. The city has twice suffered ignominies at the hands of the suburbs. One upon the loss of its consistency to the suburbs in the 50s and 60s when everything south, but, and this is more important, and again of that upon that constituency's return. These prodigal citizens brought back with them their new desires for control and predictability. And I think this is a kind of really a cruel paradox that the rediscovery of the city by the kind of suburban type actually leads to the suburbanization of the metropolis, which we see almost everywhere. And that is perhaps why the model of China or the model of the kind of extended city is ultimately perhaps a very viable model, because that kind of suburbanization is impossible. It is simply not dense enough to give you the constituency of a brand. Now, in kind of neat forms, this is taking place in a kind of minimalist district in Manhattan around Madison Avenue, where you can only get good taste, and of course, therefore, it's relatively unnoticeable to us, and it is blatantly visible in the Disneyfication of 42nd Street, but kind of essentially it is the same phenomenon. And essentially it is kind of the hair-raising speed from Jane Jacobs from Jane Jacobs to well-meaning bureaucrats to ourselves as kind of reduced to the state of ultimate consumers now confronting this realm of previously good intention but now grasping commercial need. And that is why, of course, the first diagram of America as having these kind of vast shopping spaces per person. Each person pays for the square feet of shopping that are there, and this is one form of the payment. The city of shopping goes even further now that Singapore, for instance, has abandoned the model of the city and replaced it by the model of the mall or the shopping center. In a shopping center or in a mall, identities are not stable because basically shops come and go. It's basically kind of formless entities that are accommodated in a big heap or perhaps a dump. It's an interesting topology because it's not based on exclusion or precision of the term, but on the contrary on imprecision or formlessness. So Singapore is now kind of rebranding the city, first of all, using the terminology of branding, but also diffusing kind of boundaries and turning the city in a collection of words and concepts rather than a collection of forms. So in that sense, the notion of the city and the notion of shopping has consequences on urban form, as for instance also in Las Vegas, perhaps more than anywhere else in Las Vegas, where of course we're used to consider all of this as kind of funny, exploitative, etc., or eccentric, but where now we are actually confronted with complexes of unbelievable, literally unimaginable ingenuity, at least as complex as anything in the Forum Romanum, but where it used to be a series of discrete separate identities, we now have going through the city a kind of system of modernization that is based on the model of shopping, that has no form, that has no shape, and that is perhaps, and I will talk about it later, best described certainly not as architecture but as an ecology. It's a new condition, it is a new condition of complete artificiality, complete interiorization, complete potential instability of its iconography, but connected for the first time where in the Venturi study each casino had its own identity, its own place, its own autonomy, and was kind of behaving according to certain architectural rules. 30 years later, the architectural rules have vanished and the law of shopping has kind of taken over. And here you see how, again, kind of this is almost like a rhizome, kind of going through the city and kind of at essential junctures connected by these. I already mentioned that kind of perhaps the best way of describing it is an ecology, and that is why it's interesting. The Harvard project does not only have architects or planners, but also landscape architects. And kind of one of the landscape architects kind of simply read the city, not as a kind of urban form, but started to read it in terms of ecological laws and ecological handbooks and ecological philosophy. And then discovered that the behavior of these forms is actually extremely close to the laws of ecology, where there are a kind of system of patches and where there are certain laws of kind of the survival of those patches, and in order to survive they have to have a kind of soft core and tentacles and have to kind of enrich their perimeter to create it, to make it more receptive to interaction. And so it turns out that seen as that ecology, or the laws of ecology, or the science of ecology, is actually perhaps the one that is able to also explain the kind of eccentric shapes of the shopping condition, certainly much more than any architectural or kind of urbanistic, traditionally urbanistic law can. And given the fact that the ecology, that shopping itself, or that this kind of urban condition is evolving as an ecology rather than an architecture, it is also interesting that it itself has a very drastic effect on nature, or on what used to be nature. Perhaps a theme that was launched by the 1850 large exhibition in London, which in Hyde Park captured one of the trees respectfully, supposedly. It fitted its nave. Now we have a totally different nature, namely replascape, which is a new form of between interior design and landscape, which uses real landscape elements, but which then kind of denatures them systematically. So the palm is killed, drained, embalmed, and then as it is embalmed, it receives a new skeleton and can be accommodated according to new forms. So here you see the detail of how it is done. So it's kind of like a half-dead thing. It's still vegetal. Here you see the trunk kind of being stripped and receiving a new armature. And thanks to that armature, formerly straight trees can then form the kind of rainforest and therefore correspond to the new ecological consciousness that Sanford was mentioning this afternoon. Now, for me, what is kind of still one of the main interests, and this is a kind of particularly, I want to kind of bring it back to shopping and architecture. And I want to read this quote. Sometimes, whether in slapstick or Greek tragedy, we are blind to what most threatens us, oblivious to exactly those forces that decide our fate. Such is the situation of the architect vis-à-vis shopping. At the end of the 20th century, only the architect is ignorant of its apotheosis, dysfunctional toward its implications and oblivious to its impact. And here I want to kind of show these projects of shopping that, and simply ask the question which we asked ourselves, you know, why don't we enjoy this? And what is wrong with it? And why can shopping not, even though it is so incredibly strongly striving for a spatial experience and to be read as a spatial experience, what kind of flatness, in spite of this kind of three-dimensionality, holds it back in terms of kind of engagement with this world? And for that, we have a kind of theory which looks at both John Jurdy and Frank Gehry, and it is not an entirely kind of gratuitous coupling, because they went to the same school and also shared an office once, we discovered. And it is really interesting for us to see what is going on. And here the question again, you know, why is only the bottom image beautiful and all the other ones shit? How can it be explained? And so for Jurdy, and so Jurdy is this kind of shopping specialist who is actually, according to himself, an enormous, incredible visionary. And this is, and I think he is, and this is his project for Euro Disney. This is, you know, where shopping almost turns back on itself, or goes to the kind of shopping barrier and comes out kind of really urban. The theme park as a hyper-formalist city. But now, what we started to do was to look at, compare the work of Jurdy and Gehry, and kind of this is the City Walk in Universal City, and this is the Festival Disney in Paris by Frank Gehry. And you see the kind of same fractal kind of ecology tentacles kind of imposing on the, and you see also the same kind of verticalities, and you see actually very much the same architecture. But it gets even more bizarre if you compare the Guggenheim in Barcelona with perhaps what it allows us to do is to read the Guggenheim as a mall or as a kind of shopping center. And but of course that doesn't mean that kind of Frank Gehry is not a great architect, but it probably means, and this is kind of really the both exhilarating but also kind of slightly scary thing, that we all design shopping centers now. And that conforms, and that is perhaps the kind of the final kind of underlying hypothesis, that by treating shopping so long as a kind of unconscious, we have been kind of incredibly negligent in terms, and that we have incorporated this unconscious exactly in the kind of most avant-garde regions of the profession. And I would say that our present obsession with continuities, with warped planes, with Möbius bands, is kind of really a very late flowering of all the laws and an application, in fact, of all the kind of precedents that have been kind of established by shopping since the beginning of the century in its kind of relentless ascent. And that what is kind of potentially tragic is that right now we are doomed to simulate the aesthetics of a domain that we have simply never entered through a kind of intellectual arrogance. Okay, now, and this is kind of something which is slightly raw. Basically, in the shopping book, there's also a little chapter that I want to kind of present as a footnote, which is my attempt to deal with what this all means, because I've never spoken about space, but somehow kind of this challenge of kind of dealing with shopping or understanding shopping made it kind of for me important to try to do this anyway. So I want to kind of read a small part, and then this is kind of basically a rhetorical part, but then also discuss some of the kind of issues. And the main quote is Logan Airport, a world-class upgrade for the 21st century. Okay, let's talk about space then. The beauty of airports, especially after each upgrade, shopping centers, the sparkle of renovations. Let's wallow in public space, discover casinos, confront theme parks. If space junk is the human debris that litters the universe, generated by the space program, so-called, junk space is the architectural residue humankind leaves on the planet. And so therefore, that is a kind of concept that I want to kind of launch here, or launch in the book, junk space, because I think that is really what we are kind of dealing with. The build, but more about that later, product of modernization is not modern architecture, but junk space. Junk space is what remains after modernization has run its course, or more precisely, what coagulates while modernization is taking place. It is the fallout, and it is the fallout of modernization. Junk space looks as if a hurricane has rearranged a previously ordered condition, but that impression is misleading. It was never coherent and never aspired to be. We think that junk space is an aberration, but it is essence, the main thing. It was a mistake to invent modern architecture for the 20th century. The whole point is that there is no 20th century architecture. We have been reading a footnote under a microscope, hoping it would turn into a novel. And I think that what is, for me, the really fascinating condition of junk space is that although it is incredibly intricate and incredibly ambitious, that it is at the same time incomprehensible and literally unmemorable. I challenge anyone to kind of recall with precision a current episode at Heathrow Airport, or a current episode, and perhaps even kind of finally a current episode at Gary's Bilbao. The kind of overdose of all these kind of things simultaneously, and at the same time their fragility and their kind of internal competition simply creates an entirely new condition. Patterns imply repetition or ultimately decipherable rules. Junk space is not only beyond geometry, but beyond pattern. Because it cannot be grasped, junk space cannot be remembered. Flamboyant, yet unmemorable, like a screensaver, its refusal to freeze, ensuring instant amnesia. The only certainty is conversion, permanent, followed in rare cases by restoration. And here, all these are, I think, fairly memorable, but you cannot remember them. And what then kind of I find perhaps equally interesting is that junk space is not only that it's so precarious and so unstable that perhaps we have to kind of shift our perception of architecture away from the expectation of stability toward the expectation of instability. So here, the ultimate status of the build, the condition on which it should be judged, is no longer at rest, definitive, but in motion, instead of becoming provisional. While our entire vocabulary presumes a static condition of space, we are in fact dealing with a continuous conversion. In classical space, the materiality is based on the definitive condition that could only be modified at the expense of at least partial destruction. In junk space, it is the conditions of the permanently provisional that has become normative and dictates materialization. Matter and components are now chosen for their mutability and convenience of their cutting, bending, tearing, and new softness. And I think that here you will see this is, and perhaps also this is Bilbao, although it's not Bilbao. And here the kind of a conversion of an airport where the entire process is going on, and at the same time intense labor. And so this is then the kind of at the end of the 20th century, not the builder but the taper at work. Anyway, so although this is not perhaps a very coherent lecture, what I hope to have shown is the extent not only of the enormity of the kind of process of shopping, because shopping is only kind of really a pretext, but what is for us perhaps the most both alarming but perhaps also kind of interesting discovery about the whole process is that the experience of space and the production of space are now fundamentally changed, and that therefore not only our vocabulary but also our whole way of conceptualizing space is actually not ridiculed but either a kind of simulation of this earlier condition or at its peril a complete obliviousness to it. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe we could get up from the audience.
It's working? Yeah. It's interesting, you could take different fields besides shopping and do the same thing. I mean, you could take any bloom, couldn't you? In the ocean or in the atmosphere or anywhere and see what's growing really fast. That's the first skeptical comment I'd make. In other words, the arbitrary, if you looked at the growth of airports in the last 40 years or 100 years, you could see them growing incredibly fast and also crashing incredibly fast. And the same is true of housing, mass housing. The same is true of, say, the electronics industry, the building of microchips. Blooming and crashing. And the same is true of even offices. So the question is, why is shopping more essential than all the other blooms and crashes that are going on? I mean, you make a case that it is revolutionarily different, and it challenges our space conceptions and challenges us. But is it really? And does it take priority over all those other blooms?
Basically, let's say the modesty of the problem means to take one specific thing without pretending it's the only thing or the thing or the most important thing. It's just a zoom. But I do think that you cannot argue, although the conditions of the city certainly changed to the increase in hospital, but I don't think it has changed in the same drastic manner. And I think that what's unique here is that shopping, exactly because of this danger, this endangered status, has been incredibly virtuosic in associating itself with almost every other given, and therefore it has a kind of strange finality at this point in the center, and inevitability of this point, where it literally is the most pervasive thing, perhaps. And I think that for that reason, it is at least to me, a very interesting phenomenon. And also, I genuinely believe that this association with our current, let's say, most refined spatial invention and the presence of shopping is also a very true and inevitable connection that was never untangled. Maybe. But I mean, in that sense, I think that the thesis is purely not it's a thesis. And so we are not the providing proof. It's a kind of thesis that, and I think that's actually why I think the work is really interesting. That we don't pretend to tell truth, but we interpret things in a particular way.
We have a question back on this side. You have to speak up.
Well, I think that I've always resisted the kind of simple kind of venting of opinions, and I will continue to do so because it is clear, I think, by the fact that I'm investing so much time in it, that I find it a critical phenomenon, and that means probably also that I cannot even answer your question in a kind of very direct way, good or bad. But I mean, in that sense, I think that the definition early of being both oversaturated and undernourished is a kind of very, let's say, accurate reflection of also my, on the one hand, sense that there is something important and which by sheer effort or will can be invested with quality, but at the same time, the sense that this kind of subject resists that kind of investment.
I just want to make a comment on the thread which you've been importantly reintroducing into the profession early on. It's very blindness to vital and large-scale ongoings, whether it's on the periphery, whether it's certain suburban developments, whether it's certain new typologies, etc. And at the same time, then pointing out that somehow subconsciously, as you say, the kind of spaces which Gary produces, or what you call the avant-garde, is articulating is kind of infected by that or taken on. I just want to reflect that it is less kind of unconscious, at least semi-conscious, because that kind of awareness or awakening has been gone through a few times, and it was the Venturi with Learning from Las Vegas, where the profession has been, and its discourse step outside, and your own kind of retroactive manifesto, whether it's the US New York or bigness, had certainly its effect, and there's a consciousness of wanting to engage. Nevertheless, I think where society places its avant-garde architects won't let them go there unless they destruct their kind of career and reputation. Nevertheless, we in the academic realm and in our discourse, not our buildings, we have been there and want to be relevant.
No, I agree. I mean, I didn't mean to be pedantic that nobody knows what we know, and of course, and even if it's simply unconscious, it isn't in itself common. And perhaps I insist on the importance also for ourselves of retaining things unconsciously. But nevertheless, I think that in this case, the kind of filtering from a world of apparent banality has. It's not so much that we have been unable to recognize that we are inspired by it, but that we have been unable to read the phenomenon itself as an interesting phenomenon, I think.
that this sort of feature of shopping and retail activity in the city isn't just a kind of need to respond to, but it's a thing to reflect on in terms of the way we actually work as architects. And I think the question I would have has to do with the way in which you actually construct the argument, which is really interesting. I think one of the ways the work of OMA has distinguished itself is the kind of images, the techniques it uses to describe the city that the work is responding to in a way. And I think, any sort of advertiser sitting in here today would say, God, what great ad copy in terms of the kind of images, rather than privileging plans or maps or things that a certain kind of modern architect would. You tend to go to a kind of visual image and the overlay of text and a photographic imagery that's not only familiar as ad copy, but also, for example, used by certain critical artists within a kind of tradition of the critical institutional critique that you seem to actually be working with fairly consciously. What would your comment be about the kind of
I would
material?
say, I mean, it's important to, let's say, not connect it to our office, because our office has nothing to do with it. And I hope that they get better from it, kind of, through osmosis. But and it's actually a group project that is done by the students, and even the layout is done by one of the students here to me. So in that sense, but of course we are trying to. I mean, obviously the intention is to communicate the contents of the work, and that has been something that is always, I think, been a very strong consciousness concern on my part.
Maybe one of the lessons of this project be that a lot of things that were traditionally done by the architect, like organizing, controlling, etc., of masses of people or smaller groups of people, have been partly, or even for a large part, taken over by other kind of disciplines. When you're, for example, referring to these tracking systems, or when you're referring to military people invading in Sears, etc. Has the role of the architect in that sense changed?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm always kind of really bad at the role of the architect, yeah, I'm sure it has changed. But I think that what is more to the point is that the conditions have changed, and that we think that we're doing things outside jump space, but we are doing things inside jump space. So I think that would be, but with the same rhetoric, with the same confidence, and the same pleasure, presumably.
Very long to know that one of your favorite words is exhilaration, and but more interesting than that, I would say there's a new kind of affect which you have very carefully placed into architectural discourse, and it's the placing of the word exhilaration next to abjection. And it's clear that what I see now when I watch this, because it's the first time I've actually I've read this lecture, I've never heard it presented. I realize that what you're doing is it's a kind of an encyclopedic project of the history of junk. The history of junk, from PDR through shopping, through et cetera, and it seems that it's a very moving and clear image, the idea of looking at the 20th century through as a footnote through a microscope. One suddenly does realize probably that the 20th century is a century of junk, of Taco Bells, of Nike Town. In fact, we're really realizing the great dream, perhaps. But I also remember the days when you were interested in the Pearl River development, all of the all of the interest in ultra-rapid development, the incredible economic growth that was taking place, the population forecasts for the world were stating something that totally supported the claims that the research seemed to be making. And then it all fell apart. Well, not all completely, but quite a bit fell apart a few years later. And then, and I really do believe that what's contributing to junk space today is a whole variety of things, not just the actual detritus that modernization and insane retailing that has taken place, but things like cell phones, for example, the way they just destroy and utterly pollute a kind of event space, etc. So I began to realize that what you're doing, in a certain sense, is a project. I would say, it's a project of let's say it's more rhetorical than scientific. In fact, it really basically says, look at today. and look at the modalities by which our culture seems to be expressing its irrepressible need for junk. Now, I wanted to ask you this: is that the case, or is it something else? Is modernization, you know, I mean, if I may bring this up, for somebody whose roots are so avowedly rooted in situationism, it is clear that your work now is very, very heavily on the side of spectacle rather than situation. In the sense in which, if you remember, Guy Debord was talking about from the heart of the early '60s about the way banks used to give out keychains as a form of marketing, and how far we've come now.
I mean, it's not on the side of. I think that's kind of really a serious misnomer, because my private kind of convictions and private life kind of remain, let's say, deeply, and even our own work is kind of very often very innocent vis-a-vis these phenomena. I certainly think, pretend that in certain cases we're not doing junk space. But I think that on the other hand, it is too simple to interpret the PRD as junk space, because I think there is a new model, and I think that model has certain virtues, and I think that once those virtues are identified and in a way articulated, it can also begin to do something with it. And one of the kind of interesting phenomena of what you call the collapse of the plural delta, I don't personally believe that there's anything even of a kind of very acute slowdown. There is a kind of a pause, so to speak, and what is interesting is that the pause is used in the conditions as a kind of moment of reflection, and kind of similarly the issues that the kind of situation raises are openly addressed, questions are kind of openly asked. There is a degree of professionalization in the whole discussion of the model, so I don't think that you should be that negative.
Well, actually, I wasn't really being negative, but I remember one of the great interests there was that development was going to happen faster, not even faster than designing and planning was going to happen, but faster than it could happen. And now you're saying there's a pause, which might mean what? It might mean the arrival of the carpet-bagging planners, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent it will happen, but then it will perhaps accelerate again. But again, the important thing is to not apply it to myself or my work in a sense.
Rem, there's a way, though, following on from that comment, that you obviously are very aware of this concept, which has been bandied about for 20 years now, of junk DNA. And recently, junk DNA is finding more and more uses. And in a way, although you can attack it as detritus or see the history of the 20th century as junk DNA, you can look at it as a second growth ecology and see that you could actually colonialize this. And in effect, you are saying that on a certain level, aren't you? A second growth to this junk space, and that's a way of looking at it as a potential for another kind of growth, aren't you? I mean, that's why you're completely ambivalent, because you damn it out of one side of your mouth and then say it's unique and fascinating out of the other side.
I don't think I'm damning it.
Well, you do know.
I think that
half of your words.
I think the damning is simply your own projection.
No, sorry, but a lot of your words are pejorative. I'll quote them back to you if you've forgotten them. But no, come on.
Let's stop there. Rem, thanks very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
Bye.